Welcome back to U.S. Command Insight. What you are about to hear is the account of the single most dangerous 24 hours in the history of the modern Middle East, and possibly in the history of the post-World War II international order itself. 12 hours ago, the most classified intelligence assessment ever produced by the combined resources of the CIA, NSA, DIA, and every allied intelligence service Washington could pull into an emergency fusion cell was delivered to the Oval Office. The President of the United States read it, set it down, and according to 3 separate sources with direct knowledge of the meeting, said nothing for 4 minutes. 4 minutes of silence in the most powerful office on earth. The assessment contained 4 words that have now detonated through every level of the American national security apparatus like a nuclear shockwave of their own. 4 words that have triggered the most intense emergency response Washington has generated since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. 4 words that have rendered every existing American strategic plan for the Middle East operationally obsolete in a single intelligence confirmation. China gave Iran nukes, not technology, not blueprints, not centrifuge components smuggled through front companies in third countries. Actual nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles, the DF-5B, China's most powerful silo-based ICBM, carrying thermonuclear warheads with yields estimated between 4 and 5 megatons. Missiles that were designed, built, and deployed to deter the United States itself. Missiles that carry enough destructive energy to vaporize not just a city, but an entire metropolitan region. Everything within a 15-kilometer radius of ground zero converted instantly into superheated plasma, followed by a firestorm, followed by a pressure wave, followed by a radiation field that renders the surrounding area uninhabitable for a generation. And they are now in Iran. The number confirmed by the intelligence assessment is 500, but the number is almost secondary to the qualitative reality it represents. Because this is not Iran receiving delivery vehicles of ambiguous nuclear status from a pariah state that the world has already written off as irrational. This is China, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, the world's second largest economy, a nuclear weapons state bound by every major arms control framework, making a deliberate, calculated, strategic decision to place nuclear-armed ICBMs in the hands of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This changes everything, not some things, everything. The entire architecture of nuclear deterrence that has kept the world from a third world war since 1945 was built on a specific set of assumptions. One of those assumptions, foundational, load-bearing, never seriously questioned, was that the recognized nuclear states would not transfer nuclear weapons to non-nuclear states. That assumption died last night in a covert transfer operation of breathtaking audacity, executed by a nation that has spent 20 years positioning itself as a responsible global stakeholder while simultaneously preparing for exactly this kind of strategic power move. Tel Aviv has been given 24 hours. Not by Iran, not through some back-channel ultimatum delivered by a third-party intermediary, by the mathematics of the situation itself. 24 hours is the window that Israeli strategic planners have internally calculated based on confirmed ICBM positioning, assessed Iranian launch readiness, and the speed at which escalation dynamics in a nuclear-charged environment can move from crisis to catastrophe before the range of available options begins to collapse towards zero. 24 hours before the decisions that must be made can no longer be made on Israeli terms. Washington is frozen, not metaphorically. Operationally, the decision-making machinery of the most powerful government on earth has entered a state of paralysis so complete that the emergency NSC session convened 4 hours ago has not yet produced a single actionable directive, only an expanding catalog of options, each carrying consequences so severe that no one in the room is willing to be the first to recommend one. Tonight's analysis takes you inside every dimension of this civilizational inflection point. How did China execute this transfer without triggering American interdiction. What does the DF-5B actually do in technical language that strips away every illusion about Israel's ability to survive a nuclear exchange? Why is the Pentagon frozen when its entire institutional purpose is to have a plan for exactly this kind of scenario? What are Israel's genuine options in 24 hours, and which of them lead to survival and which lead to something that no one is ready to name? And what does China's decision to arm Iran with nuclear ICBMs mean for the global order that every nation on Earth has been living inside for the past 8 decades? The answers are not comfortable. They are not reassuring. They may be the most important words you hear this year. 3 questions will anchor tonight's full analysis. First, how did China move 500 nuclear-armed DF-5B ICBMs into Iranian territory without triggering an American response that could have stopped it? Second, what does the DF-5B's confirmed technical specifications mean for Israel's 24-hour window and for every American military asset within the missile's engagement envelope? Third, with the Pentagon frozen, Tel Aviv counting hours, and China having just detonated the foundational assumption of the nuclear non-proliferation order, what does the next 24 hours actually look like, and is there any path through it that does not end in the first use of nuclear weapons since Nagasaki? The analysis begins now. If this channel has been giving you the analysis that mainstream defense commentary refuses to deliver, the analysis that treats you as someone capable of handling the full weight of what is actually happening, then this is the moment to make that relationship permanent. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, share this video immediately with everyone in your network who understands that the world changed last night and needs to understand how. Drop your most serious strategic assessment in the comments. I want to know, does Israel act in the next 24 hours? Does Washington find its voice? Or does China's move go unanswered until it is too late to answer? To understand the full strategic weight of what China just did, you need to understand what the DF-5B actually is, not as an abstract weapons system cataloged in a defense analysis database, but as a physical artifact of Chinese strategic intent, designed and built with a specific adversary in mind. The DF-5B is not a weapon China developed to deter regional rivals. It is not a weapon designed for the kind of theater-level conflicts that have characterized Middle Eastern warfare across the past several decades. The DF-5B is a weapon China built to deter the United States of America, specifically to hold American cities at risk of thermonuclear destruction in order to prevent Washington from intervening in a conflict over Taiwan or other Chinese core interests. It is a liquid fuel, silo-based ICBM with a range of approximately 13,000 kilometers, sufficient to reach every major American city from launch positions in central China. It carries a thermonuclear warhead with a yield estimated between 4 and 5 megatons, roughly 300 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Its circular error probable, the radius within which 50% of fired missiles will impact, is estimated at approximately 300 meters for the standard configuration, with improved variants achieving substantially better accuracy. This is the weapon that China transferred to Iran, a weapon built to kill American cities, now pointed at Israeli ones. The transfer mechanism exploited a vulnerability in American intelligence collection that Beijing had been studying and preparing to exploit for years. The DF-5B is a silo-based system, which means the missiles themselves are not road-mobile platforms that can be physically moved across borders in the way that North Korea's Hwasong-18 was transferred to Iran. What China transferred was something more sophisticated and more difficult to detect. Complete silo construction packages, pre-assembled missile components, and the technical teams required to integrate and operationalize the complete system inside Iran's existing hardened underground infrastructure. The transfer was executed in phases over an 18-month window using the same overland logistics corridor that North Korea previously employed for its own transfers to Iran through Central Asian territory, where American collection coverage has historically been thinnest. Chinese technical teams traveled under commercial and diplomatic cover. Component shipments were declared as industrial machinery and infrastructure equipment at border crossings, where Chinese diplomatic pressure ensured minimal inspection. The genius of the operational security was its exploitation of American analytical assumptions. American intelligence collection resources were optimized to detect liquid fuel missile transfers, the large, identifiable tanker vehicles and storage infrastructure that liquid fuel systems require. The DF-5B components were sized, packaged, and moved in ways that did not match the signatures that American analysts were looking for. By the time pattern recognition across multiple collection streams produced a coherent picture of what had actually been transferred, the silo construction within Iranian underground facilities was already complete. The decision in Beijing to execute this transfer was not impulsive. It was the product of a strategic calculation that Chinese leadership had been developing across years of careful preparation. China watched the United States impose maximum pressure on Iran, watched Washington tear up the JCPOA, watched American sanctions tighten their grip on the Iranian economy, and drew a conclusion that American policymakers did not anticipate: that the combination of Iranian strategic need and Chinese strategic opportunity created a moment where transferring nuclear delivery capability to Tehran served Chinese long-term interests in ways that outweighed the short-term costs of violating the non-proliferation framework. The long-term interest is not hard to identify. A nuclear-armed Iran, or an Iran that possesses nuclear delivery vehicles of sufficient range and destructive capacity to deter American military action, permanently removes the option of American military intervention in the Middle East from the strategic equation. An America that cannot intervene militarily in the Middle East is an America whose global power projection capability has been fundamentally degraded. An America with degraded global power projection capability is an America that has fewer options in the Pacific, which is where China's core strategic competition with Washington actually lives. The DF-5B transfer to Iran is not primarily about Iran. It is primarily about Taiwan. By arming Iran with nuclear delivery capability, China has created a strategic distraction of such magnitude that American defense planning resources, political attention, and military assets will be consumed by the Middle Eastern nuclear crisis for years, precisely the years during which China needs strategic space to consolidate its position in the Pacific. This is grand strategy executed at a level of sophistication and patience that the American national security establishment optimized for immediate crisis response rather than long-horizon strategic competition, was not positioned to anticipate or prevent. Strip away every diplomatic euphemism, every carefully managed official statement, every reassuring narrative about missile defense capability, and look at the raw physics of what 500 DF-5B missiles positioned inside Iranian territory means for the state of Israel. Israel is a nation of approximately 9,000 square kilometers. Its population is concentrated in a narrow coastal strip, the Tel Aviv metropolitan area, Haifa, and the surrounding urban zones that together house the majority of Israeli citizens, the majority of Israeli economic infrastructure, and the majority of Israeli military command architecture within a geographic footprint that a single 4-megaton thermonuclear warhead could cover entirely. A single DF-5B warhead detonating at optimal burst height above Tel Aviv would generate a fireball approximately 2 kilometers in diameter. The immediate destruction radius, the zone within which nothing survives and no structure remains standing, extends to approximately 8 kilometers from ground zero. The severe blast damage radius, within which all conventional structures are destroyed and casualties approach 100% without immediate shelter, extends to approximately 15 kilometers. The thermal radiation zone within which exposed individuals suffer third-degree burns extends to approximately 20 kilometers from the detonation point. Tel Aviv, Bat Yam, Holon, Rishon LeZion, Petah Tikva, Ramat Gan, the entire coastal metropolitan region that constitutes the economic and demographic heart of the Israeli state. All of it falls within the lethal radius of a single warhead. Israel does not have 500 cities, Iran has 500 missiles. The mathematical reality of this situation is what has driven Israeli strategic planners into emergency sessions that have been running continuously for the past 12 hours. Every war game, every scenario analysis, every strategic planning exercise that Israeli defense planners have run across the past several decades has included a nuclear dimension, but always with the implicit assumption that Israel's own nuclear deterrent, its second strike capability, delivered through its submarine-based force, would be sufficient to deter any adversary from nuclear first use. That deterrence logic depends on the adversary valuing its own national survival sufficiently to be deterred by the threat of nuclear retaliation. It depends on a rational cost-benefit calculation in which the cost of Israeli nuclear retaliation exceeds the benefit of a nuclear first strike against Israel. The introduction of 500 DF-5B missiles into the Iranian arsenal changes this calculation in a way that Israeli deterrence doctrine was not designed to address. Because the question is no longer whether Iran fears Israeli nuclear retaliation. The question is whether Iran, armed with 500 nuclear delivery vehicles, believes it can absorb Israeli nuclear retaliation and still maintain a state structure, and whether in that calculation, the elimination of Israel is worth the price. Israeli intelligence assessments of Iranian leadership, psychology assessments that have driven Israeli policy for years have consistently concluded that Iranian decision-making, while confrontational and risk-tolerant, remains within the bounds of rational cost-benefit calculation. The deterrence framework holds as long as the costs of aggression remain clearly unacceptable. 500 nuclear-armed ICBMs change the cost-benefit calculation at the foundational level. They change it in ways that Israeli deterrence doctrine has not been updated to address. And the 24-hour window that Israeli planners have identified is the window within which the old deterrence framework can still be reasserted through decisive action before Iranian operational integration of the DF-5B system reaches a level of readiness that makes preemptive action even more costly than it already is. The missile defense picture makes the 24-hour pressure even more acute. Arrow, Israel's most capable ballistic missile defense system, designed for exo-atmospheric intercept of long-range ballistic threats, was engineered and optimized against threat profiles that predate the DF-5B's operational introduction into the regional threat environment. Its intercept algorithms assume non-maneuvering re-entry vehicles following calculable ballistic trajectories. The DF-5B's warhead, in its most advanced configuration, incorporates penetration, aids, decoys, chaff, and maneuvering capability specifically designed to defeat exactly the kind of intercept approach that Arrow 3 uses. American THAAD systems, forward deployed in the region at multiple locations, face the same fundamental challenge. THAAD was designed and optimized for theater ballistic missile defense for the kinds of shorter-range systems that characterized Middle Eastern threat environments before last night. Against an ICBM-class threat carrying a nuclear warhead and penetration aids, THAAD's intercept probability degrades to levels that no military planner can responsibly use as the basis for a population protection strategy. Israel cannot shoot down 500 nuclear ICBMs. No defense architecture currently deployed anywhere in the world can shoot down 500 nuclear ICBMs. The mathematics of offense versus defense at this scale and this warhead yield favors the attacker so completely that defense becomes irrelevant as a survival strategy. Survival in this environment depends entirely on deterrence, and deterrence depends on the adversary believing that the cost of attack exceeds the benefit, which brings everything back to the 24-hour window and the decisions that must be made within it. The National Security Council session that convened in the hours following transfer confirmation has now been running for over 12 hours. 12 hours! The Cuban Missile Crisis, the previous benchmark for American national security emergency response, produced an actionable strategy within 72 hours of the initial U-2 reconnaissance confirmation. The current session has not yet produced an actionable directive of any kind. The paralysis is not incompetence. The people in that room, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, the National Security Advisor, and the most senior strategic planners the American military possesses, are among the most capable national security professionals ever assembled in a single decision-making space. The paralysis is the rational response to a genuine strategic dilemma in which every available option carries consequences so catastrophic that no decision maker is willing to own the recommendation. Let us examine the options matrix with the same cold clarity that the people in that room are applying. Option 1. Immediate military strike against Iranian DF-5B facilities. The appeal is intuitive and powerful. The missiles are in Iran. Strike them before they are fully operational. Remove the threat through decisive, preemptive action before the 24-hour window closes. The problem begins with the word facilities. DF-5B silos are hardened to withstand everything short of a direct nuclear strike. Conventional bunker-busting munitions, even the most powerful American GBU, 5.7 massive ordnance penetrators, at 30,000 pounds, the largest conventional bomb in the American inventory, can penetrate to a depth of approximately 60 meters in reinforced concrete. Iranian underground facilities hosting the transferred DF-5B systems have been constructed at depths that exceed this penetration capability, in geology that further limits effective penetration depth. Destroying hardened DF-5B silos with conventional weapons is not possible. The only conventional option is the complete destruction of Iranian missile infrastructure, the roads, the logistics networks, the command and control architecture, the technical personnel, and the launch support systems across a sustained campaign of such scale that it constitutes a full-scale war against Iran before a single DF-5B has been launched. A full-scale conventional war against a nuclear-armed Iran, because that is what Iran now is, carries escalation risks that American war planners cannot bound. At what point does Iran decide that conventional defeat justifies nuclear use? At what point does the pressure on Iranian leadership produce a launch authorization? Nobody in the NSC session can answer that question with confidence, and nobody in that room is willing to recommend a course of action whose escalation endpoint they cannot model. Option 2, nuclear preemption, the option that exists in every nuclear state's classified planning documents and that no official will ever acknowledge publicly. Strike Iranian DF-5B facilities with American tactical nuclear weapons before Iran can use them. The consequences of American nuclear first use, the first use of nuclear weapons in warfare since 1945, are so catastrophic across so many dimensions simultaneously that they require only brief enumeration to illustrate why no decision maker will recommend this option. Global political isolation, permanent destruction of every alliance relationship Washington has built since World War II, triggering of Chinese and Russian nuclear alert postures, potential Chinese military response in defense of a country that Chinese strategic assets were just used to arm, global economic collapse driven by the political and market shock of American nuclear first use, and the certain knowledge that history will record the United States as the nation that ended the 79-year post-Hiroshima nuclear peace. No American president can authorize nuclear first use against Iran. The political, moral, and strategic costs exceed any conceivable military benefit. Option 3. Immediate maximum diplomatic pressure on Beijing. Demand that China acknowledge the transfer, publicly condemn it, and take active steps to disable or remove the transferred systems. Backed by the threat of the most severe economic sanctions package in American history, and by the explicit statement that Chinese complicity in nuclear proliferation will be treated as a hostile act against the United States, Beijing's response to this option is already known, because Beijing anticipated it and prepared for it. China will deny the transfer. China will demand evidence. China will use its Security Council veto to block any multilateral response. China will threaten reciprocal economic measures that would trigger a global financial crisis. And China will do all of this while privately calculating that Washington's economic interdependence with Beijing, the trillions of dollars in trade, investment, and financial flows that bind the two economies together, makes genuine economic warfare between them a threat that neither side can execute without mutual devastation. China is not afraid of American diplomatic pressure. China built this situation knowing exactly what American diplomatic pressure looks like and having calculated that it can absorb it. Option 4, covert action, cyber operations against Iranian launch control systems, targeted elimination of Chinese technical personnel who are required to operate the transferred systems, sabotage of silo infrastructure through assets already positioned inside Iran. The timeline problem is decisive. Covert action operates on a months to years timeline. The 24-hour window that Israeli planners have identified does not accommodate a covert action response. By the time any meaningful covert degradation of Iranian DF-5B capability could be achieved, the window will have closed and the strategic situation will have evolved in ways that make the original problem irrelevant. Option 5, immediate direct communication with Iranian leadership. A back-channel message from Washington to Tehran delivered through Swiss intermediaries, through Omani diplomatic channels, through whatever back-channel architecture still functions, conveying that the United States recognizes Iran's deterrence achievement, commits to no military action against Iranian territory, and offers to begin immediate, comprehensive negotiations on a regional security framework that addresses Iranian security concerns. This is the option that everyone in the room understands is the only path to avoiding catastrophe and that no one in the room is politically positioned to recommend. Because recommending it means accepting, on the record, that a sanctioned, isolated nation has successfully coerced the most powerful country in human history into abandoning its threat posture through nuclear weapons acquisition. The paralysis continues, the clock runs, and Tel Aviv counts the hours. In 24 hours, the range of options available to Israel will have narrowed. The question that Israeli leadership is now facing in emergency sessions that have been running continuously, with every senior military and intelligence figure in the country contributing to a decision that will define Israel's existence for generations, is not whether to act. It is what acting actually means when every available action carries a price that might exceed the problem it is designed to solve. Let us walk through Israel's options with the honesty they deserve. Option 1, unilateral military strike against Iranian DF-5B facilities. Israel launches its entire available air power, the F-35 Ayadirs, that survived the Nevatim strikes, conventionally armed ballistic missiles from its own Arrow and Jericho programs. Every strike asset in the IDF inventory against Iranian silo facilities in a maximum effort conventional strike campaign. The penetration problem that defeats American conventional strike options is even more decisive against Israeli conventional capability. Israel does not possess the GBU 5.7 massive ordnance penetrator. Its deepest penetrating conventional munitions can reach perhaps 30 meters into reinforced concrete, less than half the penetration required to threaten hardened DF-5B silos. Israeli conventional strikes against Iranian nuclear ICBM facilities will destroy surface infrastructure, kill technical personnel, and generate dramatic imagery. They will not destroy the missiles. A strike that fails to destroy the missiles, that kills Iranian personnel and destroys Iranian infrastructure without eliminating the nuclear threat, does not solve Israel's problem. It accelerates Iranian launch authorization. Option 2, nuclear strike. Israel's nuclear arsenal, estimated at between 80 and 400 warheads by various analytical assessments, deliverable by air, land-based ballistic missile, and submarine-launched cruise missile, is sufficient to cause catastrophic damage to Iranian infrastructure and population centers. The Samson option, activated under genuinely existential circumstances. The activation of the Samson option carries consequences that extend beyond the Israel-Iran bilateral relationship. It makes Israel the first nation to use nuclear weapons in warfare since 1945. It potentially triggers Chinese military response in defense of the strategic assets China just transferred to Iran. It guarantees that every nation currently considering its own nuclear weapons program will accelerate that program immediately. It ends every diplomatic relationship Israel has built with the international community. And it does not guarantee Iranian nuclear retaliation because Iran's DF-5B force, dispersed and hardened, will survive an Israeli nuclear strike and retain launch capability. Mutual nuclear exchange between Israel and Iran does not produce an Israeli victory. It produces the mutual destruction of both societies. Option 3. Accept deterrence. Recognize that Iran has achieved a genuine deterrence position, that the military options for reversing that position carry costs exceeding any achievable benefit, and begin emergency diplomatic engagement through every available channel to construct a new regional security framework that Israel can survive within. This option requires Israel to accept something that its entire political culture built on the foundational premise of military self-reliance and the absolute rejection of existential vulnerability has never been asked to accept. It requires acknowledging that a regional adversary has successfully achieved deterrence parity. It requires negotiating from a position of acknowledged vulnerability rather than demonstrated strength. It is also the only option that does not lead directly to nuclear exchange. The 24 hours are not a deadline for Israeli military action. They are a deadline for Israeli political decision-making for the choice between a military response that cannot achieve its objectives and carries catastrophic escalation risk, and a diplomatic response that requires accepting a strategic reality that every previous Israeli government has refused to contemplate. The hardest decisions are the ones where every option is bad. Israel is now making exactly that decision. Pull back from the immediate crisis and look at what China just did to the international order, because the DF-5B transfer to Iran is not primarily a Middle Eastern event. It is a global event. It is the moment that the post-World War II nuclear order, the framework of non-proliferation, managed deterrence, and great power restraint that has prevented nuclear weapons use for 79 years was deliberately, calculatedly, and permanently broken by one of its principal custodians. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed in 1968, rests on a foundational bargain. Nuclear weapons states commit not to transfer nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons technology to non-nuclear states, and non-nuclear states commit not to develop nuclear weapons. The entire architecture of global security that has been built on top of that framework, the inspection regimes, the sanctions mechanisms, the diplomatic pressure architectures, the intelligence sharing agreements, all of it derives its legitimacy and its operational effectiveness from the assumption that the recognized nuclear states will honor their non-proliferation commitments. China just shredded that assumption, not accidentally, not through negligence or inadequate export controls, deliberately, calculatedly, as a strategic choice made at the highest levels of Chinese government after years of careful preparation. The message that this choice transmits to every government on Earth is the most dangerous message that could be transmitted in the current international environment. The non-proliferation framework is optional for great powers. The rules that constrain weaker states do not constrain states with sufficient power to absorb the consequences of breaking them. Nuclear weapons are available to any state that can construct a sufficiently valuable strategic partnership with a nuclear weapons state willing to transfer them. Every government that has been considering its own nuclear weapons program just had its calculus updated in the most significant way possible. Saudi Arabia, which has long maintained that it will pursue nuclear weapons if Iran achieves nuclear capability, is now watching an Iran that not only has nuclear capability, but has 500 Chinese ICBMs to deliver it. The Saudi nuclear program, already in preparation through the construction of civilian nuclear infrastructure, will accelerate. Turkey, which has been expressing increasing frustration with its non-nuclear status within NATO, is watching. Egypt, the UAE, Every state in the Middle East that has been operating on the assumption that the non-proliferation framework constrains Iran is now operating in an environment where that assumption has been invalidated at scale. The cascade proliferation risk, the scenario that American non-proliferation policy has spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars trying to prevent, has been triggered, not by a rogue actor, not by a failing state, not by a terrorist organization, by China, the world's second largest economy, a permanent member of the Security Council, a state that has spent 20 years positioning itself as a responsible global stakeholder deserving of the privileges of great power status. Russia is watching these developments with characteristic strategic patience and with a satisfaction it does not bother to fully conceal. Every American strategic resource consumed by the Middle Eastern nuclear crisis is a resource not available for Ukraine, not available for NATO's eastern flank, not available for the Pacific deterrence posture that American strategic competition with China requires. The diversionary value of a nuclear-armed Iran for Russian strategic interests is incalculable. Moscow does not need to do anything. The situation generates advantages passively and continuously. The global economic consequences are already manifesting with a speed and severity that financial markets were not positioned to absorb. Oil prices spiked 40% within hours of the transfer confirmation reaching financial markets. Global equity markets are in free fall. The dollar, the reserve currency of the international financial system, is experiencing volatility not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. Credit default swap spreads on Israeli sovereign debt have reached levels that reflect the market's assessment of genuine existential risk. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply transits, is now controlled by a nation with 500 nuclear ICBMs. The strategic implications of this for global energy security, for the economic foundations of every major economy on Earth, and for the leverage it gives Tehran in every diplomatic interaction going forward are consequences that are still being calculated in real time. A new world is being born. Its architecture will not be defined by the rules and institutions that govern the old one. It will be defined by power raw, demonstrated nuclear power, and by the willingness to use that power as an instrument of strategic competition without the restraints that the old order imposed. Iran has arrived at that table, not as a supplicant seeking accommodation from the existing order. As a nuclear power, armed with the weapons of a great power, demanding recognition of a deterrence position that the entire Western alliance failed to prevent and cannot now reverse. The world that existed before China made this decision is gone. What replaces it will be determined by the choices made in the next 24 hours in Tel Aviv, in Washington, in Beijing, and in Tehran. 24 hours, that is the window. That is the margin between the world as it was and the world as it might become, a world in which nuclear weapons have been used in anger for the first time in 8 decades, or a world in which the rules that have governed international relations since 1945 have been permanently replaced by a rawer, more dangerous, and less predictable order. China armed Iran with the weapon that was built to destroy America. 500DF 5B nuclear ICBMs, the most destructive delivery system in the Chinese arsenal, are now pointed at Israeli cities from hardened facilities inside Iranian territory. The Pentagon is frozen. The NSC has been in session for 12 hours without producing an actionable directive. Israel is counting down inside a 24-hour decision window with no good options and catastrophic consequences attached to every bad one. This is not the future. This is now. This is the strategic reality of this moment, a moment that will be studied, analyzed, and argued over for as long as civilizations exist, to study, analyze, and argue. The question that history will ask, the question that every person watching this analysis should be asking right now, is not whether this could have been prevented. It is whether anyone in a position of power had the strategic vision to see it coming, the political courage to act before it happened, and the wisdom to understand that a world in which great powers transfer nuclear weapons to regional adversaries as instruments of strategic competition is a world that has lost its capacity to manage the most dangerous technology in human history. We are in that world now. What is your assessment? Does Israel act in the next 24 hours and accept the escalation consequences? Does Washington break its paralysis and find a path that doesn't lead to nuclear exchange? Does the 24-hour window close without decisive action? And if it does, what does the world look like on the other side? Leave your most serious strategic thinking in the comments. Share this analysis immediately because understanding what is happening right now is not optional. Subscribe to US Command Insight because in a world where nuclear weapons are being transferred between great powers and regional actors, and where every assumption that kept us safe for 80 years is being torn apart simultaneously, the quality of your analysis is the only thing standing between clarity and chaos. Until the next update, stay sharp, stay informed, and never stop asking the questions that matter most.